Hey everyone, so this is the magic thing inside a Corsair ThermalProtect cable that's meant to protect your GPU from melting. And in my last video I tested out Corsair's ThermalProtect 12V power cable and I had unreliable results because sometimes the protection was kicking in and then sometimes it wasn't. Since my original video went live at the start of this week, I've had loads of really useful feedback, plus Corsair actually responded to it. So in this video I wanted to do even more testing of the ThermalProtect cable, and then I wanted to do a live teardown and actually show off exactly how the cable works, and then I wanted to address Corsair's feedback, and based on all of my testing and the feedback and the comments, I then wanted to say whether I now recommend the ThermalProtect cable or not. So this cable is the Corsair ThermalProtect 12V 2x6 or 12V power cable, and it's universal, meaning you can use it with any PSU that has a native 12V power slot. You don't just need a Corsair PSU. And it has a thermal sensor inside of it, so basically if the 12V power is too hot due to a pin imbalance or any other issue, then basically this thermal protection will kick in and then cut off most of the power flow into the GPU, and that's then going to protect against melting. And in my original video what I did was actually test the cable by progressively cutting live wires going into the GPU, and what that does is drive up the amperage on the remaining wires, and more amperage equals more heat. So basically my original approach was saying that, by driving up the amperage, that's actually going to sort of stress test the temperature sensor inside the cable. But in that original video I was actually having unreliable results because the protection wasn't always kicking in. But George, who's the marketing director of Corsair, on Reddit, he actually recommended me actually trying to get a temperature probe inside the cable, because I could then gauge exactly how hot the temperature is building up inside that cable comb. And luckily my DC clamp meter actually supports temperature probe, so that was completely perfect. But it was actually a bit difficult to actually get the temperature probe inside of the Corsair cable, because the cable comb is actually very well built, so it wasn't as easy as just slipping it in there. I did actually try ripping out one of the wires, thinking I could then put the temperature probe in its place, but even then it was really hard to actually remove a wire. But eventually I was able to sort of prise the plastic open just enough to shove the probe right up there. Anyway, with the probe firmly inserted, I could then actually start my test, or my retest. And firstly I wanted to do exactly what I did last time. So basically I turned on the system, I run Firmark, and that is drawing over 300 watts, which was 28 amps down that single wire. And obviously my logic being that if you have too much amperage, that's going to drive up the heat, and then the heat's ultimately going to melt the connector and things like that. And I was monitoring the temperature of the probe, and even after 25 minutes it was barely getting above 30 degrees Celsius, which clearly isn't enough to trip the protection, which is actually 65 degrees Celsius. And the thermal camera view backed this up too, because while you can see that one remaining individual wire standing out, because ultimately it is getting hot, ultimately the cable and the thermal sensor isn't getting quite hot enough, because the cable comb itself that contains the temperature sensor is only hitting 25 to 30 degrees Celsius, which is far below the level you'd need to actually cause things to trip. And this was probably part of the issue I had in my previous video, where the protection was only tripping 50% of the time, because I was doing my testing, and even now I'm doing my testing in a detached garage, where the ambient temperature is more like 12 to 14 degrees Celsius. And the reason I'm not doing it inside this house is that this house is fairly new. It's got a built-in sprinkler system which is super sensitive, and I'm not being defensive, but actually what some people don't always realize with these videos, and as being a content creator, is ultimately if I do something wrong and set off the sprinkler system, then we'd have to move out. I'd be flooding my house and stuff. So that's why I was testing in my detached garage, but ultimately there probably just wasn't enough heat building up to trip the thermal protection inside the cable. So what I then did is actually put the side panel back on, thinking that if that's on, hopefully more heat will actually build up inside the case, and that might actually trigger off the thermal protection. But unfortunately, after waiting quite a long time, the temperature only went up 1 or 2 degrees Celsius, so that plan wasn't exactly going to work. So I took the advice from someone in my YouTube comments in the original video called Dissecting Truth, which is a really apt name, and I went to get my heat gun. And while you could argue this is kind of a fake test because you're artificially warming things up too much, ultimately I only have a 5070 Ti and I'm testing in a detached garage, and as a result, that combination means that I'm probably not going to get to a point where the thermal protection is going to trip at 65 degrees Celsius. So I thought that by adding the heat gun to the mix, that's actually going to more reliably show whether the Corsair cable works or not. And thankfully the heat gun worked very quickly. The moment I turned it on, you could see the temperature probe getting very hot, ramping up quite quickly, and when it got to 75 degrees Celsius, the Corsair protection kicked in and cut all power to the GPU, and then you can see that there's no output on the screen and everything else. And it's worth quickly clarifying that Corsair say that the protection kicks in at 65 degrees Celsius, whereas my temperature probe was showing 75 degrees Celsius. But I think that's just because I couldn't get the probe all the way up there. I don't know how to say that in a non-dodgy way. And as a result, the temperature probe I was using was probably further away than the temperature sensor was. But either way, that shows the cable works because I could reliably get it to trip, under those conditions. And if you look at this thermal camera view, you can see that the bit from the cable comb all the way to the GPU connector is really, really hot. And it had cooled down a little bit because I'd waited like a minute or two before I started recording, but it's still showing around 55 degrees Celsius. So you can see that actually it would have been around 65 degrees Celsius when the protection actually kicked in. And that's different to my earlier tests where things weren't getting as hot, and you can see the thermal camera view there. The sort of cable comb and the bit that goes to the GPU connector wasn't getting as hot. So 5 points to Gryffindor, or dissecting truth, because actually the heat gun idea was a very good suggestion, so thank you for that. Now at this point the cable had started to become quite deformed due to actually using the heat gun, which is going to soften things up. And I'd also noticed that one of the pins had popped out of the 12-volt power connector completely from the end, probably from when I was yanking it at low to the start of this video. And one of the things I didn't really cover enough in my original video was that, having any 12-volt power cable being able to support all this yanking and prodding and have 28 amps or more flowing down a single wire without melting is actually really, really impressive. So I should have drove that point home more because, yeah, it is credit to Corsair that they've built this really sturdy cable which can stand up to all of the stuff that I actually threw at it. Anywho, at this point we've proven that the cable does actually work, but that was only with one test, so I wanted to give it another test to check it reliably trips at that point. So even though the cable was quite deformed at this point, I managed to plug it back in and I ran Firmark again. And the temperature was a touch above 30 degrees Celsius, so still not high enough to actually trip the actual thermal sensor protection. So I went to get my heat gun again and I retested, and this felt like a really weird video throughout, just stood there with a completely deformed, mangled cable with a heat gun there, just trying to, destroy it basically. But thankfully when things got to the exact same point, which is 75 degrees Celsius, based on where the temperature probe was, it again tripped. And this actually validates what Corsair say, both on the marketing and what they said to me as well, which is that when the temperature gets to a certain point, it will reliably trip. And that's due to this magic box that we'll look at in just a minute. More on that point later though, because I felt that the cable and the cable comb was really soft due to the heat gun, so I decided to do a teardown, and prizing off the plastic cover was easy enough. And we can see the metal contacts on the back that would have been touching all, 6 of the 12 live wires, or at least the bundle of wires. And then turning around, we can see where the sense wires were, which I, yanked off, but basically they would have been attached to this magic middle box, but basically this is the thing that's sitting inside the cable comb, and it looks like a really simple solution, but essentially what it is you've got metal contacts that basically sandwiches between the 12-volt power wire bundle, and then there's a temperature sensor which is rated for 65 degrees Celsius. That would be sat up against the actual metal, just like that, and then there's a wire connecting to the sense pins, and then because this is connected to the sense pins, those sense pins can then send a signal to the GPU to actually cut all of the power. So that's actually really cool, and using that temperature probe I could basically predict exactly when the temperature cutout was going to happen, which again validates this approach. And that takes us to what Corsair told me in response to my video, which you can see on screen now. And as I mentioned in my original video many times, I was actually aware that the original cable is a temperature solution and not an amperage solution. But seeing how this works and then being able to see it reliably trip actually gives me a lot more confidence that the ThermalProtect cable is good and can work, and it is something I'm going to be using. Having said that though, when I successfully actually finally rob a bank and I buy an RTX 5090, I'm not sure if I'd want to just use the ThermalProtect cable and nothing else, because I'd be probably ultra paranoid, and in that case I'd probably want to have a real-time view of the per pin amperages and things like that. And as a result, something like the WireView Pro 2 from Thermal Grizzly could actually make more sense to someone like me who's a bit ultra paranoid, but then I'd probably couple the Corsair ThermalProtect cable with it, so I'd kind of have the best of both worlds. So was I wrong in my original video? Well, I guess the answer is yes, kind of, because while I did actually correctly stress test things by cutting the wires and having high amperage, and we did see that that does drive up the temperatures, ultimately I didn't stress test things enough. Because I was in my garage and only using a 5070 Ti, that's not going to drive things up to the level it needed to reliably trip. So that's my overall view, but if you've got any questions, please leave them in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, please click the thumbs up button, and please subscribe to see more videos like this. Thanks for watching.